Kevin wasn't an ordinary man. His life was a constant succession of private jets, meetings in glass skyscrapers, and parties where champagne flowed as freely as the fake smiles of his guests. But on that day, something made him change course. He felt exhausted, and whenever he felt like this, he liked to distract himself by driving aimlessly, thinking about aspects of his life. Upon reaching a small town, about 60 miles from New York, Kevin came across a small restaurant. Simple, unpretentious, but with a certain charm that attracted him. It was the kind of place where people came to forget their worries for a few hours, and that's what he needed. He entered, feeling comfort in the simplicity of the environment. The walls, covered with old paintings, and the wooden tables worn by time, gave the place a sense of warmth that he hadn't felt in a long time. Mary had been working in that restaurant for years, and she observed for a moment the man who headed to a table in the corner near the window. It wasn't common to see such a well-dressed man in that place, but she didn't have time to think about it. She had tables to wait on, orders to take, and little time to get lost in conjecture. As she approached to take his order, she said, "Hi, my name is Mary, and I'll be your server today." She offered him the menu with a gentle smile, and he looked her directly in the eyes for the first time. It was a quick glance. Kevin placed his order without much enthusiasm, choosing the simplest dish on the menu. He wasn't there for the food, just for the distraction of seeing how ordinary life went on, without so many meetings and worries. As Mary walked away, he let out a sigh, feeling the weight of a life that, in others' eyes, seemed perfect, but for him was becoming increasingly unbearable. Mary returned to the kitchen to relay the new orders. The routine suffocated her, but it was all she had. Taking care of her sick mother and working endless hours at the restaurant left her no time to dream of a different life, college perhaps, but reality kept her firmly anchored, preventing her from imagining anything beyond what her eyes saw every day. As Kevin waited, he looked around, observing the other people in the restaurant. Families, couples, friends, they all seemed to live such simple lives, yet so full of purpose. He wondered what it would be like to live like that, without the constant pressure of maintaining an image, of always earning more and more money, no matter how much he already had, without the need to always be ahead of everyone. But he quickly pushed those thoughts away. He knew his life would never allow for such simplicity. When Mary returned with the plate, Kevin observed her more closely. She seemed so young, yet so tired. It was as if the weight of the world was on her shoulders, something he felt too, but for completely different reasons. There was a moment of silence between them, a silent connection of souls lost in their own realities, before Mary moved away again to attend to another table. Kevin started eating, but the taste of the food reminded him of his grandmother's cooking. He didn't know what it was, but he felt that this place, this woman who had served him with a sad smile, were somehow linked to what he was looking for. Mary continued with her work, but she felt the weight of that gaze following her throughout the restaurant. She tried to ignore it, but it was impossible. Something had changed since that man walked in, something she couldn't understand, but that left her restless. Night fell slowly, almost as if hesitating to embrace the small town. In the restaurant, the yellowish lights reflected in the windows, creating a cozy but also melancholic atmosphere. The crowd began to thin out, and Mary, exhausted, breathed a sigh of relief at finally being able to slow down. Kevin remained at his table, observing the environment with a restless serenity, sometimes fiddling with his cell phone, sometimes sipping the now cold coffee in the cup in front of him. It was then that the door opened, and two men entered. They were poorly dressed, their faces half covered by caps and hoods, as if they wanted to avoid being recognized. Mary noticed their entrance with a shiver that ran down her spine, but she forced herself to keep her composure. After all, strange people came in there all the time. She approached to serve them, but they ignored her, going straight to the bar. Without a word, they sat down, exchanging quick, nervous glances between themselves. Kevin, who until then had seemed distant, immediately sensed that something was wrong. He had developed an instinct for danger, having taken several courses from ex-FBI agents and weapons courses for the best possible self-defense. He enjoyed that. And now, that same instinct was screaming in his mind, warning him that these two figures weren't there for a quiet meal. The atmosphere in the restaurant changed. Even the customers who were still there seemed to feel the tension in the air, as if something invisible was about to happen. Mary, who was behind the counter, observed the men out of the corner of her eye, feeling a growing discomfort. She looked at Kevin, as if seeking some kind of security, but he remained impassive, his expression becoming increasingly closed off. The two men at the bar began to speak in low voices, their words inaudible to others, but their actions were enough to make everyone around uneasy. One of them nervously fiddled with his jacket pocket, while the other looked around the restaurant, as if calculating something. Kevin saw this and clenched his fists, feeling the adrenaline start to rush through his veins. He knew he had to be prepared for anything. Mary, trying to push away the fear growing inside her, approached the men again, forcing a smile. "Can I take your order?" she asked, her voice betraying the calm she was trying to maintain. One of the men looked at her coldly, his eyes scanning her up and down. "We're still deciding," he replied, his voice low and threatening, like the whisper of a predator about to attack. Mary retreated, feeling the implicit threat in his words, and turned back to the counter, her heart pounding in her chest. Kevin observed every movement, every expression, understanding that what was happening here was more than just a bad night. He saw the fear in Mary's eyes and knew he needed to act. Kevin took a deep breath, trying to control his racing heart. He looked at the exit, evaluating the possibilities, but the only certainty he had was that danger was approaching, getting closer and closer. The night, which had previously promised only tranquility, was now charged with a tension that threatened to explode at any moment. The tension in the air was almost unbearable, as if everyone was trapped in a forced silence, waiting for something horrible to happen. And then, without warning, the two men at the bar stood up at once. One of them pulled a gun from inside his jacket, the cold, deadly metal reflecting the restaurant's yellowish light. The other did the same, drawing his weapon and pointing it at the terrified customers. "Everybody on the ground now!" shouted the first, his voice tearing through the air like a blade. Panic spread immediately, and the sound of chairs being dragged and glasses falling to the floor echoed through the restaurant as customers obeyed, trembling with fear. Mary, who was near the counter, froze for an instant. Fear paralyzed her, her legs feeling like lead while her heart hammered so hard she thought she might faint. But fighting against the panic, she forced herself to move, to slowly lower herself to the ground. Her wide eyes instinctively sought Kevin, as if he could offer some protection, but he was already lying on the floor, his eyes fixed on the robbers. Kevin felt the impact of the cold floor against his chest, but his mind was elsewhere, working a mile a minute. He analyzed every movement of the assailants, noticing how they positioned themselves, how their hands trembled slightly as they held the guns. They were amateurs, he realized, but that didn't make them any less dangerous. In fact, their nervousness could make them even more unpredictable. The robbers began to move through the restaurant, the second one yelling at the cashier to open the drawer and hand over all the money. "Quick, or I'll blow your head off." The shout was loaded with desperation, causing the young man at the register to shake uncontrollably as he tried to open the drawer with trembling hands. Mary was lying on her side, her head resting on her arm, trying to control her breathing. Every fiber of her being was in panic, but she knew she needed to stay calm, or at least appear to be. If she showed too much fear, if she made any sudden movement, it could trigger a reaction she wouldn't be able to control. One of the robbers approached her, and Mary smelled the sweat and fear emanating from him. "Where's the owner of this place?" he demanded, his voice sharp and cutting. Mary tried to answer, but her voice came out weak, almost inaudible. He's not here," she finally managed to say, her words coming out in a trembling thread of a voice. The robber looked at her with contempt and hit her on the head with the gun, pushing her with his foot so that she lay face down, pressing her face against the hard, cold floor. Tears began to stream from Mary's eyes, but she held them back, knowing that crying would only make her an even easier target. Kevin, lying a few feet away, saw it all happen. He felt a growing anger inside him, an anger he hadn't felt in a long time. The sight of Mary being treated that way, of innocent people terrorized by desperate men, made him want to get up, to fight. But he knew that any rash movement could cost dearly. The robbers were almost finished ransacking the cash register when a sound from outside caught everyone's attention. A car stopped abruptly in front of the restaurant, its headlights illuminating the interior for a brief moment. The robbers looked at each other, the fear in their eyes growing as they realized time was running out. The silence in the restaurant was dense, broken only by the muffled sobs of some terrified customers. The robbers were tense, their heavy breathing echoing through the space as they tried to decide what to do next. Kevin, still lying on the floor, felt the weight of the moment on his shoulders and knew he needed to act, not just for himself, but for all the innocents around him, and in particular for Mary, who was bleeding from her head and trembling on the floor, slipping into panic. With a calculated movement, Kevin slowly raised a hand, catching the criminal's attention. "Hey," he said, his voice calm but firm, cutting through the tense air. "Let's talk." One of the robbers, the one who seemed to be the leader, turned quickly, pointing the gun at Kevin, his narrowed eyes full of distrust. "Shut up," he growled, but there was something in the way Kevin stared at him that made him hesitate. "I understand you're in a tough situation," Kevin continued, ignoring the threat. He knew the type. Desperate men, cornered, trying to maintain control over something that had already slipped from their hands. "But it doesn't have to be like this. Nobody here wants trouble." The second robber, even more nervous, stepped forward. "Shut your mouth, man, or it'll be worse for you." The gun was shaking in his hand, and Kevin knew that any wrong move could trigger a tragedy. Taking a deep breath, Kevin slowly brought his hand to his wrist, unfastening the luxury watch he was wearing. He knew that object could be worth more than anything the robbers expected to get from this restaurant. "Here," he said, raising the watch for them to see. "This watch is worth more than everything you can get here today. Take this and the money I have with me, but leave everyone in peace." The robbers exchanged a quick glance, hesitation evident. They hadn't expected this. Someone who, even in a situation of extreme danger, maintained composure and offered a solution. The leader stepped forward, snatching the watch from Kevin's hands with an abrupt gesture. He examined it for a second before looking back at Kevin. "Why are you doing this?" the leader asked, his voice now less firm, almost confused. Kevin kept his gaze fixed on the man's, unwavering. "Because nobody needs to get hurt today. You can leave here without committing a worse crime than necessary." He cast a quick glance at Mary, who was motionless on the floor, her eyes full of tears and fear. That motivated him more than anything else at that moment. The second robber, still nervous, looked at the leader, waiting for a decision. The leader lowered his gun, though he still held it firmly. He was visibly torn, anger and desperation in conflict with the tempting offer Kevin had just made. Mary, realizing that Kevin was trying to save the situation, began to cry silently, tears streaming down her face. She could hardly believe what was happening, what that man was willing to do for her and the others. His gesture touched her in a way she never imagined possible, a stranger risking everything to ensure her safety. The leader of the robbers looked at Kevin once more, trying to understand the logic of this man. "And if we take this and don't leave?" he asked, his voice laden with threat, but also uncertainty. Kevin kept his cool, though his heart was pounding in his chest. He knew the line between life and death was thin that night. "You have what you came for," he replied. "Anything beyond that will only complicate your lives further. It's not worth it." The restaurant plunged into a deathly silence. The air was heavy, each second dragging with an unbearable weight. Kevin stood firm, hoping the robbers would accept his offer. But then, suddenly, the situation changed. The sound of sirens in the distance cut through the silence, a distant noise that was rapidly approaching, reverberating off the restaurant walls. Everyone froze, and the nervousness among the robbers visibly increased. The customers on the floor held their breath, terror etched on their faces. Mary felt her blood run cold, her heart beating uncontrollably as she looked at Kevin, hoping he would know what to do. The more nervous robber, already on the verge of collapse, began to panic. "Damn! They're coming!" he shouted, his wild eyes desperately searching for an exit. He looked at the leader, expecting some guidance, but the uncertainty reflected in the other man's gaze offered no comfort. Kevin noticed the immediate change in the situation. He knew that panic could lead to something terrible. "Easy," he said, his voice firm, but it was too late. The more nervous robber raised his gun in a sudden movement, and the sound of a shot echoed in the small space of the restaurant. The gunshot resonated like thunder, causing customers to scream and cower even more on the floor. The bullet pierced the wall beside a customer's head, making dust and small pieces of plaster fall slowly, almost in slow motion, as everyone looked up in shock. The leader of the robbers spun toward his companion, his expression quickly changing from surprise to anger. "What did you do, you idiot?" he shouted, but the other was already in a state of absolute panic, his eyes bulging as he heard the sound of sirens getting closer and closer. Mary, who was closer to the counter, felt tears running down her face. The sound of the shot still echoed in her head, and everything inside her screamed for her to flee, to run away from there. But her legs were locked to the floor, and all she could do was look at Kevin, who remained still, still trying to negotiate amidst the chaos. Kevin remained outwardly calm, but inside, he knew the situation was rapidly spiraling out of control. He saw the fear in the eyes of everyone around him, but his focus was on the robbers. He knew that any movement could be misinterpreted now, and the danger was real, palpable. The sound of the gunshot had transformed that environment into a powder keg, ready to explode at any moment. The sirens were now practically at the restaurant door. The red and blue lights of the patrol cars flashed outside, casting unsettling reflections on the walls. The panic among the robbers increased exponentially. The leader was frantically looking at the exit, while the second robber kept his gun pointed, his hands shaking uncontrollably. Kevin knew that the presence of the police didn't mean immediate safety. On the contrary, it could be the spark for an even greater tragedy. He didn't dare move, didn't even dare to breathe deeply, as he waited for the next step, knowing that each passing second increased the tension unbearably. The restaurant was now trapped in a fragile threshold between fear and violence, where any gesture, any sound, could be the beginning of something irreversible. Mary, lying on the floor, felt small and vulnerable, her heart tight with uncertainty, silently praying that this would end without more blood being spilled. The robbers were on the brink of desperation. The sound of sirens was now an oppressive presence, a relentless countdown approaching its inevitable end. The leader looked around, his eyes scanning the restaurant for a solution. He knew time was running out, and in his mind distorted by fear, the only way out was to use the innocents there as human shields. "You and you," he growled, pointing the gun at Mary and Kevin. "Get up, now." Mary felt her legs tremble, but she had no choice but to obey. With her heart in her throat, she slowly stood up, her eyes meeting Kevin's for a brief moment. His expression was serious, but there was a fierce determination there, something she couldn't fully understand, but which gave her a strange comfort. Kevin, forced to stand up beside her, maintained his outer calm, though inside he felt the crushing weight of the situation. He was aware that things had gone from a simple robbery to something much more dangerous. He had to do something, but he knew his options were limited and that any mistake could cost dearly. Not just to him, but to Mary and the others. The robbers began to move towards the back exit, pushing Kevin and Mary in front as shields. The tension in the air was so thick it was almost suffocating. Kevin felt Mary's sweaty hand touch his lightly, a gesture of pure human need, seeking some comfort in the midst of chaos. They moved slowly, footsteps echoing on the restaurant's wooden floor, while the sound of sirens now seemed so close that the entire building seemed to vibrate. The second robber, still trembling with fear, continued pointing the gun, his eyes blinking frantically as he checked the windows and doors at every moment. When they reached the back exit, the leader opened the door with an abrupt movement, but before they could take a step outside, they suddenly stopped. Out there, in the darkness, a dozen guns were pointed at them, the lights of the patrol cars illuminating the narrow alley, revealing the overwhelming police presence. "Shit!" the leader hissed, pulling Kevin and Mary back inside. Anger and fear were consuming him, and he knew they were now cornered. No way out, no chance of escape. His wild eyes fixed on Kevin, as if blaming him for his misfortune. Kevin felt the critical moment approaching. With a deep breath, he made the only decision he could at that instant. He knew there was no other way, that he needed to risk everything to save Mary and the others. He turned slightly to the leader, trying to appear as calm as possible, despite the adrenaline burning in his veins. "You don't need to do this," Kevin said, his voice low and controlled, almost a whisper amidst the chaos. He knew words alone wouldn't be enough, but he needed to buy time, needed to create an opportunity. "Let her go. I'll stay." The leader looked at him, confused for a second, as if Kevin's words made no sense. But then, something in Kevin's tone, in the determination in his eyes, made him hesitate. "Why would I do that?" he replied, his voice laden with distrust. Kevin took a step forward, carefully, without provoking a violent reaction. "Because I'm worth more than her. You want to get out of here alive? Use me as a bargaining chip. She won't help you with that. She can barely walk straight from fear." Mary, hearing those words, felt her heart shatter inside her chest. Tears began to stream down her face again, but this time they were of pure despair. She looked at Kevin, shaking her head slightly, as if begging him to stop, to not sacrifice himself for her. The leader of the robbers hesitated for another second, time seeming to stretch as he pondered. The tension in the alley and inside the restaurant was unbearable, as if the whole world held its breath, waiting for the outcome. Finally, the leader pushed Mary aside, grabbing Kevin by the collar, the gun now pressed against Kevin's temple. "All right," he said, his voice full of bitterness. "You want to be the hero? Let's see how far that gets you." At the moment the robber was about to release Mary, one of the customers, overcome by panic, ran towards the front exit of the restaurant, where the police were positioned. The sound of his footsteps echoed through the hall, breaking the tense silence that had settled. The leader of the robbers, noticing the movement, turned quickly, the gun still pressed against Kevin's temple. "Stop! Stop or I'll shoot!" shouted the leader, his voice full of desperation and anger. But the customer, driven by fear, kept running, oblivious to the danger he was putting everyone in. The police, alerted by the sudden movement, began to approach, guns in hand. The leader of the robbers, feeling cornered, pressed the gun even harder against Kevin's head. "Nobody move! Nobody move or he dies!" he shouted, his voice trembling with nervousness. Time seemed to drag on, each second stretching into an eternity of tension. The police, now closer, tried to negotiate, their voices firm but concerned. "Release the hostage and we can resolve this peacefully," said one of the officers, trying to keep calm. The leader of the robbers, however, was beyond the point of negotiation. His eyes were wild, desperate. "I said nobody move!" he shouted again, his voice almost a roar. The sound of the gunshot echoed through the restaurant, followed by a deafening silence. Mary, who was next to Kevin, pushed him back and a scream was heard, a sound of pure despair and pain, as Kevin fell to the ground, seeing Mary's body go limp and also fall, blood spreading around them. He didn't know what had happened, thought he had taken the shot, and there was a lot of blood on the floor, until he realized that Mary had pushed him and taken the bullet in his place. The police, taking advantage of the distraction, quickly advanced, subduing the leader of the robbers and his accomplice. But it was too late for Mary. Kevin held her in his arms, his trembling hands trying to stop the blood, but it was useless. "Mary, don't close your eyes," he whispered, Mary's tears falling to the ground. Mary, with a last breath, looked at him and said, "Take care of my mother, my life was never worth anything," she murmured, before closing her eyes for good. The restaurant, now a scene of chaos and despair, was filled with sirens and flashing lights. Mary's sacrifice had saved his life. No one had ever done anything like that for him. Soon the firefighters were on top of her, working, giving adrenaline, but he could only watch everything in slow motion. The firefighters and paramedics worked frantically, trying to stabilize Mary, who lay unconscious on the floor. Kevin, still stunned by the sacrifice she had made, was beside her, holding her cold and inert hand. "Please save her," he pleaded, his voice almost a whisper, as the paramedics worked quickly to stabilize Mary. They put her on a stretcher and took her to the ambulance, Kevin following closely, refusing to leave her side. At the hospital, the medical team rushed to attend to Mary, who was in critical condition. The shot had gone through her neck, and every second was crucial. Kevin, feeling helpless, watched from afar, his heart tight with anguish. His voice firm, but full of desperation. "Do everything necessary to save her." The doctor nodded, understanding the gravity of the situation. "We'll do our best," he replied. "Do the impossible." Kevin was taken to the waiting room, where he sat, head down, hands trembling. Every minute seemed like an eternity, and he couldn't shake the image of Mary, throwing herself at him and taking the bullet, and then pale and motionless, from his mind. Hours passed, and finally, the doctor reappeared, his face serious. "She's stable, but in a coma," he said, his voice grave. "The bullet went through her neck, and she lost a lot of blood. We'll monitor her closely, but we can't guarantee anything at this point." Kevin felt the world crumble around him. He had done everything he could to save Mary, but now all that remained was to wait. He stood up, determined to stay by her side, no matter what happened. "Can I see her?" he asked, his voice almost a whisper. The doctor nodded, leading him to the room where Mary was. She was connected to several machines, her face pale and serene. Kevin sat down beside her, holding her hand, feeling the weight of silence and uncertainty. After all, she had given her life for his. Time seemed to drag on painfully for Kevin. Each day was a struggle to keep hope alive, while Mary remained in a coma, trapped in a world of silence and darkness. He had returned to his routine of meetings and commanding the conglomerate of companies. But life seemed empty and meaningless, Mary always in his thoughts, and at least 3 times a week he visited the hospital, sitting beside her and whispering words of encouragement, even though she couldn't hear him. One day, after almost 2 months while Kevin was in a meeting in downtown New York, his phone rang. It was the hospital. His heart raced, a mixture of hope and fear taking over him. He answered quickly, his voice trembling. "Mr. Kevin Smith, this is the hospital." "Mary has woken up from the coma," said the voice on the other end of the line, firm but gentle. Kevin felt a wave of relief and joy, but also apprehension. He quickly thanked them and hung up the phone, grabbing his keys and running to the helicopter. The journey to the hospital seemed endless. When he finally arrived at the hospital, he ran through the corridors, his heart pounding in his chest. As he entered Mary's room, he saw her eyes open, but still fragile and confused. She was pale, but alive. "Mary," he whispered, approaching the bed and holding her hand. "You're awake." Mary looked at him, her eyes confused. She tried to smile, but the pain and weakness were evident. "I don't know what happened," she said, her voice barely a whisper. Kevin gently squeezed her hand, trying to convey strength and comfort. "You were shot, Mary, but you're strong. You jumped in front of the bullet in my place. I'll never forget that." Kevin nodded, feeling a wave of love and gratitude. "I know you will, Mary, and I'm here to help." "Kevin," she whispered again, her voice still weak, but laden with emotion. "I remember you. You were a customer at the restaurant." Kevin nodded, a sad smile on his lips. "Yes, Mary. I was there that night." Mary tried to move, but the pain made her wince. Kevin quickly put his hand on her shoulder, trying to calm her. "Don't worry, Mary. You need to rest. Everything will be okay." She looked at him, her eyes full of questions and fear. "My mother. Is she okay?" Kevin gently squeezed her hand, trying to convey confidence. "Your mother is being cared for by nurses, Mary. She's fine. You don't need to worry about anything." Mary closed her eyes for a moment, relieved. When she opened them again, there was a deep gratitude in her gaze. "Thank you, Kevin." "I don't know how to thank you." Kevin smiled, trying to maintain his composure despite the emotion he felt. "You don't need to thank me, Mary. I should be thanking you. What you did was very selfless. And I just want you to recover. And when you're ready, if you want, you already have a job at my company. You don't need to worry about anything." Mary looked at him, surprised and grateful. "I don't know what to say, Kevin. This is very kind of you." Kevin squeezed her hand again, feeling a deep connection between them. "You deserve it, Mary. You're strong and brave. And I'll be here to help." The room fell silent for a moment as Mary processed everything that had happened. She looked at Kevin, her eyes filled with tears of gratitude and hope for a new beginning. He thought she had saved him, but in reality, it was he who had rescued her from a life she didn't like. "Possible," Kevin said before the doctor disappeared behind the doors of the operating room.